Hello, I'd like to talk about loot boxes today. And yeah, it's not the most pleasant topic, but I'm gonna do my best to make it fun or at least engaging so that this video is watchable. It's gonna be long, I'll tell you that. Specifically, I'm going to attempt to predict the future of loot boxes. That is, how loot boxes and similar mechanics in video games are likely to be regulated and implemented, and I'm going to do that by using a template laid out in an academic paper that talks about industries of harm, think tobacco for example, and how they respond to criticism and calls for regulation. We know already that there have been minor attempts to regulate loot boxes, mostly in Europe so far, and calls to regulate loot boxes here in the US, mostly from gamers and journalists, as well as like one or two actual politicians. We also know that loot boxes and other predatory microtransactions can be extremely harmful to people. I'm not going to say that 100% of loot boxes are bad, or that there is no possible way for loot boxes to be implemented responsibly, but for the moment, I think most of us can agree that they can cause real problems, from minor problems like getting in the way of our enjoyment of games and negatively affecting how games are designed, all the way up to major problems like emptying out your bank account because certain loot boxes and microtransactions are specifically designed to manipulate you. Before we get to the hardcore academic stuff, I'm going to talk about my own process of becoming familiar with microtransactions and some of the well-documented negative effects. And I will include timestamps in the description, so feel free to skip around to different sections if you really want to. But if you really want to hear what I have to say about the topic, I do recommend watching all of them in order. Also, I really appreciate when people subscribe and like and comment and all that YouTube stuff. Oh, I was going to mention too that I have a lot of free time right now for different reasons, so I went ahead and set up an email where people can write in or just chat, basically. Like, don't be weird about it, but I like talking to people, so you can email me at this address. It could be about these videos, or it could be about almost anything. But that's about it, so here we go. I want to quickly talk about how I first learned that microtransactions were a thing. A big part of why I was unaware of microtransactions and loot boxes for so long is that I just wasn't into games for a long time, and that happened to be about the same time where this stuff became really big. So I grew up with Nintendo hardware, then as a teenager I really fell away from it all up until a few years ago when I got a Switch, and then into some PC gaming as a result. But before I started playing games again, for some reason, I started watching a whole lot of online content about video games on YouTube. I think it was motivated by my curiosity to learn more about the really weird games of the time. In general, I'm really interested in art of many different types, so when I heard about games like The Stanley Parable and The Binding of Isaac and Bubsy Visits the James Turrell retrospective, I just felt out of the loop, and I wanted to learn about this cool art that I was completely unfamiliar with. So I was watching lots and lots of zero punctuation, previously recorded, Arlo, Spawn Wave, and eventually Jim Sterling. Now, as you probably already know, a lot of people who talk about video games online tend to only talk about the games themselves. Maybe some console talk, and very rarely they'll bring up larger industry-related topics. It's an old joke that games journalism isn't really journalism most of the time, just media criticism and product reviews, or in some cases, an extension of marketing. But every once in a while, all those channels I mentioned would get into some industry stuff as well, and in particular, Arlo and Jim Sterling spent a decent amount of time talking about the state of games in general, how they're made, how they're consumed, and issues within these processes. And if you know Jim Sterling, then you know that their work for the past several years has focused almost entirely on this kind of subject matter. Long story short, Sterling's work was my primary introduction to many different issues with the games industry, especially crunch culture and predatory microtransactions. At the time, I wasn't playing games games that really had microtransactions, except for some mobile stuff. I didn't really know how widespread it was or how microtransactions had developed since the early 2000s. And if you want to learn more about any of this stuff, I can't recommend Sterling's work enough. We're talking deep dives into how bad and even abusive practices come about and the human effects of these practices. And in fact, to make a list of the negative effects of predatory microtransactions, which we'll be getting to in a bit, I've been pulling largely from Sterling's channel, just because he's done a really good job of documenting all this stuff. There are a few articles elsewhere online from Kotaku and a bunch of smaller sites, and a couple from the BBC, which I'll be getting into, but Sterling is the gold standard for understanding the impact of this stuff. So what are the negative effects of predatory microtransactions? So we have the more tame effects here at the top, such as how they harm game design and getting in the way of players' enjoyment of certain games. So there have been a good few games, most of them giant AAA titles, that altered their game design to encourage players to purchase microtransactions. Generally, this is done by making it more difficult or more time-consuming to earn high-quality items which can also be purchased for real-world money as a way to skip the grind. Let's use an example from Ubisoft, one of the industry leaders in predatory microtransactions. So this article from Polygon talks about how Assassin's Creed Odyssey gates progress based on level, and that leveling your character can take a really long time. The sample given in the article is a quote from GamesBeat, saying that it took about 6 hours to go from level 15 to level 17. But the game also offers XP boosters as microtransactions, which of course allow the player to greatly accelerate the leveling process. There are tons of parallels of this basic concept in other contemporary games. Developers and publishers know that this design harms the baseline experience, but that's exactly the point. They want to make these purchases more appealing, and making the baseline experience more unpleasant is a great way to do that. Then there's the negative effect of players being assailed by prospective purchases. There are certain games out there where you simply can't play without having microtransactions being marketed to you in some way. One of the more innocuous forms of advertising microtransactions and DLC to players is by just placing a card, maybe on the home screen or on the game's store page. This is basically just saying, hey, we made some extra stuff that you can buy, but it's not being very pushy about it. But when this advertising starts to manipulate players via social engineering or through psychological tactics, we start to move over into territory where microtransactions become predatory and potentially harmful. Let's start with the social engineering angle. So, using social engineering to get people to buy stuff is inherently unethical. It's not new. Advertisers have had ways of doing this for a really long time. Social engineering is also just completely commonplace in gaming today. Basically, game designers and developers have ways of portraying certain practices as common, acceptable, or even desirable within the social space of any given game. One example that Sterling has used multiple times is how in Fortnite, a game with a generally very young player base, it's the socially accepted norm to use premium skins on your character, and therefore some kids end up getting bullied at school for only using the default character skin. It certainly seems that the people behind the game purposefully made microtransaction commodities the norm, and now the players, without being paid, are advertising the premium commodities to other players and are even coercing other players to spend money on these skins, some of which are tied to season passes. Okay, season passes and battle passes. This is yet another marketing trend of microtransactions that manipulates players psychologically. If you're unfamiliar, season passes typically offer a collection of commodities and events that will only be available for a limited time, and they end up encouraging a version of a subscription to a game, basically. The game is getting all these new skins and weapons and fun events, but you've got to sign up within the next couple of weeks or you just won't have access to any of it, ever. The manipulation here is all about exploiting FOMO, a term I'm sure you've heard before, fear of missing out. And again, this is not a concept that's brand new. This isn't specific to the time of the internet and social media. To a certain extent, it's been a part of human society for a very, very long time, but it has been amplified and articulated for the first time here in the 21st century because the internet and Internet of Things devices have given the average person constant 24/7 access to to what the herd is currently doing. You have to make a conscious effort to separate yourself from this information. Oh, and social media, by the way, is potentially causing a major increase in suicide ideation and actual suicide among teenagers, especially female teenagers. But that's a big topic, and we just don't have time. We don't have time. There's so much. So limited time products and services exacerbate FOMO a whole lot. Not only are you feeling anxiety about not doing the currently fun and cool thing, but you now only have a few months during which you'll ever have the opportunity to do the cool and fun thing. So now the pressure's really on, and all of a sudden, the amount of money it would take to participate and feel the comfort of social acceptance feels nominal. The fear of missing something greatly outweighs any principles you might have or your personal indifference to the thing in question. And if you needed further proof that exploiting FOMO is very desirable for publishers, check out this piece about how Activision patented data gathering technology that drives the sale of microtransactions. Specifically, these systems place players with other players online who buy lots of microtransactions, as well as targeting players who have been losing lately to sell them potential advantages. So not only is Activision eager to exploit FOMO in this way, but they also wanted to make damn sure that other companies couldn't use their cutting-edge exploitation technology. Do we have time for a story? I mean, why not, I guess. It's gonna be a long video anyway. This is gonna be a rant, so you can skip ahead if you want. So Nintendo announced the Super Mario 3D All-Stars collection. I was excited about it, only because I really like Super Mario Sunshine. That's the 3D Mario that I grew up with. I like it. I wanted to play it legally on my Switch because otherwise I'd have to find and buy a working GameCube and a functional copy of the game and a controller, which would be very expensive. I didn't really care about 64 or Galaxy. I just don't care about those games. I've played them before. I don't need them again now. But oh no, in one of the sleaziest moves in recent gaming history, both the physical and digital editions are limited time only. Okay, so now I'll only have the option to buy the thing for a few months. But oh no again, because this time span happens to fall within a historic pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen for literally hundreds of years. Work has been slow, and even when things are normal, I make very little money. I can't just throw $60 plus tax willy-nilly at a game collection, only one title of which I actually want, when I could be spending that money on stuff like groceries. I experienced firsthand, very intensely, exactly what Nintendo wanted me to experience. I felt stressed about the decision. I felt tempted. I weighed my options and tried to find room in the budget. And I bought the fucking thing. I felt the pressure and I gave in just days before the collection was going to be pulled. Even worse, after playing it, my biggest impression was that it was mediocre at best. Like, it's not that great. I really don't care about these games very much. I don't like playing them that often. And now I feel like a sucker. I have nothing but bile for the Nintendo execs who let this happen. Just straight up, fuck you. Fuck you for doing this. Just thinking about it makes me want to take a shower. There's no ethical rationalization for this move, and if Nintendo does the same thing with the Zelda collection this year, Now, I know that 3D All-Stars isn't a microtransaction, it's just a regular transaction and a pretty hefty one. But this exploitation of FOMO is designed to make people feel this way. Its goal is to manipulate. Now, closing out this section with some pretty extreme negative effects of predatory microtransactions, we have to at least mention the instances where players become what's called whales. So if you don't know, whale is the term that individuals within the games industry, I'm not going to say that it's sanctioned by the games industry, uses to refer to people who spend a ton of money on microtransactions, like hundreds of dollars worth. By the way, whale has also traditionally been a term used in the gambling industry for suckers who are likely to lose a bunch of money. So
the meat grinder is about to grind up a whale.
So I can't cover this topic in its entirety, and I also don't want to because it's incredibly depressing, but Jim Sterling has an excellent and heartbreaking video that includes testimony from players who ended up spending immense amounts of real-world money in games, often because they were already susceptible to addiction or substance abuse. Outside of that, we'll be looking at some examples soon enough of children who ended up spending tons of their parents' money, knowingly or unknowingly, in mobile games or in FIFA, because of course EA was going to get a shout out here at some point. In other words, some human beings spend more money on microtransactions than anyone ever should. And while in some cases those individuals bear some of the responsibility, this is also a best case scenario for video game publishers, and they have done extremely little, if anything, to reduce any of the measured and recorded negative effects of predatory microtransactions, which makes many of these publishers complicit in actual real-world human suffering, and financially they're benefiting greatly from it. Finally, this brings us to an explanation of why there's been so little movement to correct any of this stuff, and how things are likely to shake out for loot boxes and other predatory microtransactions in the future. Alright, so don't be scared off by the use of the word capitalism in the header. We're not going to be talking about capitalism directly, so put down the pitchforks and let's get into the really good stuff. So a while back, I found this academic paper titled Capitalism and the Politics of Resignation by Peter Benson and Stuart Kirsch. As a whole, the paper is about the widespread cultural resignation in response to the negative effects of cultures dominated by capitalism. But I'm going to limit my focus to a very interesting aspect of the paper, where the authors attempt to outline a three-phase process by which industries of harm respond to criticism and calls for regulation. Benson and Kirsch describe industries of harm this way. Production strategies in particular industries are predicated on human suffering and environmental degradation. These are harm industries. So I'm not going to say that the video game industry is 100% a harm industry. For one thing, some developers and publishers operate in a relatively responsible way, but there's definitely an argument for how certain game publishers, developers, and even console manufacturers are contributing to human suffering and even environmental degradation in some way. In particular, the materials used to create console batteries and power sources and how those materials are mined. Yeah, these are extremely harmful to the environment, but that's another topic. On the human suffering side, yes, a certain portion of predatory microtransactions cause some form of harm to some people. We have to accept that because it's true. Now, in the paper, the harm industries they chose to focus on were the tobacco industry in the US and mining operations in the developing world. So as I go through the three phases, keep in mind that these are based on how these industries responded to opposition. This paper was not written with video games in mind. I'm the one applying these concepts to gaming. Also, this paper was published in 2010, so it's been a little while. If you'd like to read the article for yourself, you can find it on JSTOR and a few other sites. I think you can read like 100 articles per month for free on there if you just make an account, which is also free. And if you're in school, you can probably get everything for free. Not sponsored, by the way, although it would be pretty fun to have JSTOR as a first sponsor. So hit me up, JSTOR. All right, so it's time to move on to the three phases of corporate response. Keep in mind that I will be summarizing these with key points. If you want all the info, it's there in the paper. And after I go through all three, I will talk about what motivates a move from one phase to the next. Okay, here we go. We made it. So let's talk about the three phases of corporate response within industries of harm as observed by Benson and Kirsch. And for each phase, I'll give examples from the paper that cite the actions of the tobacco industry in the US during each phase. Phase 1 includes these actions: limiting corporate liability, denial of issues, and the proliferation of doubt. So back in the day, the tobacco industry proliferated doubt by setting up their own research council to show that the link between smoking and disease was not based in science. Phase 2 typically involves a basic acknowledgement of a problem and purely symbolic gestures and recompense. As our example, I'll just quote from the paper: even while they continued to deny that health problems were caused by smoking, in the 1950s, tobacco companies began introducing filtration technologies and using misleading product descriptors like light and low tar to allay consumer anxieties and pursue continued legitimacy. Phase 3 typically boils down to crisis management. There are usually attempts to appropriate discourse surrounding the issue, the creation of certification programs, the recruiting of activists, and the establishment of a reasonable stopping point for regulation beyond which anything is unfair, according to the companies in question. Okay, that's a lot. I know this is all pretty academic, but as I was reading those, did you find yourself trying to apply each phase to the video game industry? Because I did, and it's why I wanted to make this video. As for why a corporation becomes motivated to to advance to the next phase, it's all about profit, which shouldn't be too surprising. Basically, whichever phase a corporation is currently executing is based entirely on how much money they currently stand to lose because of public criticism and or government regulation. In fact, these phases are not designed by corporations, and many are probably completely unaware that this structure exists. The phases were articulated by Benson and Kirsch based on research, so don't expect to see some leaked internal memo from Ubisoft that says something like, "We are now moving to phase 2. It's not like that. Also, following my own relatively limited research of how these phases apply to video game companies, I would argue that corporations can move backwards in between them as well. This isn't an exact science, is what I'm saying. And now it's time to lay out some examples that I found during research and try to fit them into the appropriate phase. Okay, so it was actually pretty easy to find some examples of companies responding to microtransaction problems with phase 1 tactics. And I feel that's because the video game industry collectively is in phase 1 right now, with occasional use of phase 2 tactics. Now remember, the key tactics in this phase include denial, limiting liability, and the proliferation of doubt. In fact, I'll keep these terms on the screen during this section. Here's the first example, which comes from an excellent BBC article talking about when kids spend lots of money on games. The main story is about a 10-year-old kid who spent £550 on FIFA 19 and didn't even get Messi, the one player that he actually wanted. The article includes a statement that EA, the publisher behind FIFA, declined to comment, but they did mention parental controls. Okay, so this falls under limiting liability. I'm not an attorney, but I can basically guarantee that the true purpose of so-called parental controls in games is to limit legal liability. If a case came to court, a publisher could very easily say, well, you know, we have these controls here. It's up to the parents to take responsibility. Also, there's a huge EULA that the user signed off on. In that same article, they mentioned the now famous incident where an EA executive not only refused to use the term loot box in, I think it was a hearing, instead opting for the term surprise mechanic, and then also said that these mechanics, which are loot boxes, were quite ethical and fun. So that's a twofer, because it's basically denial and proliferation of doubt all rolled into one. It's also making use of framing, which is a technique or a concept that's very common both in private companies and in governments. Framing is all about using certain language to frame concepts in a way that supports a certain agenda. So, for example, reframing loot boxes and surprise mechanics is an attempt to distance the wider discourse from all the negativity and scrutiny that has already been piled on the term loot boxes. That word has baggage, and if you want to keep using those mechanics, you call them something else. It reminds me of a very famous quote from Mad Men.
If you don't like what is being said, change the conversation.
And by the way, denial doesn't have to come exclusively from game industry executives. It can come from other people who are just involved in the system in some way. You've no doubt seen regular people defending microtransactions and loot boxes in their spare time. God knows why. Maybe just out of a sense of opposition, or maybe because they've been unknowingly influenced by the economic, cultural, and ideological systems that have colored their perception of the world for their entire lives. Who can say? But I recently came across this really fun example of denial from a lawyer who gave a talk at GDC in 2019 about how to not get sued about your microtransactions and loot boxes. And oh boy, this guy, ooh boy. So sorry, I shouldn't call him that. This apologist, who is complicit in the proliferation of extremely problematic monetization mechanics, mentions multiple times in this talk that he doesn't think loot boxes are a problem.
I don't really think loot boxes are a problem in the game development industry, but I do think some loot boxes are symbolic of some very real issues we face. Don't paint it as a black and white issue. Don't just say loot boxes are okay or they're bad, because the truth is it's not loot boxes that are a problem.
Then going on to say that sometimes, yeah, they can be a problem. So he's sort of combining some phase 1 and phase 2, namely flat out denial and an empty symbolic acknowledgement that there can be problems associated with these mechanics. This guy's a lawyer, so his frame of mind is permanently tied to legal wrongdoing and liability, as opposed to real-world wrongdoing and harm. So I'm not going to hang him out to dry, certainly not implying that he's done anything wrong, because he's a lawyer. and I don't want to get sued because I have nothing. There's nothing you can take. Just leave me alone. And he's just doing his job, kind of in the same way that lots of people allow serious problems to persist by using the excuse that they don't make the rules, which, by the way, is an argument explored in some depth in this great book called The Banality of Evil, Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt, which is about the Jerusalem trials of high-ranking Nazis. Anyway, this guy devotes a whole 3 minutes of his talk to responsible implementation of loot boxes in games.
For the last 3 minutes, I will talk a little bit about, as a community, how we ethically want to use loot boxes.
What a sweetie, right? What a guy. Still, this talk is a pretty good resource if you're looking for a somewhat recent breakdown of how loot boxes are regulated, or not regulated for the most part, in different countries around the world. But in most cases, big companies don't really address the loot box problem at all. I would also argue that when companies who use tons of loot boxes and predatory microtransactions choose not to comment or respond to criticism, this is another form of denial. They don't want to publicly address the issue because that would mean admitting that there is, in fact, an issue. This brings us to an excellent anecdote from Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism. So there's this company in the UK that sells cheap jewelry. Everybody knows it's cheap, but of course the company's PR still has to say all the usual nonsense about commitments to quality, blah, 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 blah. Here in the US, just think about how fast food restaurants talk so much about the quality of the ingredients, even though we all know it's garbage. So the guy at the head of the company made a big mistake, describing the inexpensive jewelry his shop sold as crap in an after-dinner speech. As a direct result of admitting to something that everybody already knew, the company's value dropped by £500 million, and the guy got fired. Moving on to phase 2 examples, we've got a good number of them here. So this is the phase distinguished by a basic acknowledgement of the problem, along with purely symbolic gestures and recompense. In another BBC article that features testimonials from parents, multiple parents talk about the huge amounts of money that their kids spent in games and apps and their attempts to recoup that money. One 12-year-old spent roughly £700 on Clash of Clans, that gem, and the kid's parent, who asked to remain anonymous, which, let's dwell on that for a second, said, "We didn't realize until we checked his bank statement and it was virtually empty. He did not realize the connection, that it was real money leaving his bank account. We never got our money back apart from a token amount as a gesture of goodwill." Yep, so that's a symbolic gesture if I've ever seen one. Another parent was lucky enough to recoup £93 from some awful emoji app. They ended up getting all the money back, but via Google, not by talking to the app developers. In fact, it's unclear whether there was any way to contact the developers at all. As far as I'm concerned, the industry as a whole hasn't actually made it to phase 2, and you can just forget about phase 3 completely. There's not even a hint of the industry trying to actively influence regulation because there's barely been an attempt to regulate any of this, especially here in the United States, which is confirmed by that lawyer guy.
Now, the United States gets a reputation as a country where corporations make all the rules and there's no consumer protection. And in the case of loot boxes, that's absolutely right.
And if you're wondering why that is, why we haven't gotten to phase 2 or 3, I have a very concise answer for you. It's because revenue hasn't been significantly threatened at all. No regulations, no public criticism, no industry-wide embarrassments have put even a dent in the profitability of predatory microtransactions. Either these things have to stop making money, or legislators need to threaten serious regulation for anything to actually change. And unfortunately, I don't see either of those things happening anytime soon. On the regulation side, even if we do get to a point where the majority of politicians and legislators are even aware of loot boxes and their effects, which I can't imagine will come anytime in the near future, I don't have confidence that the resulting regulation would be especially intelligent or helpful. And chances are extremely good that, in line with phase 3, video game companies would spend millions of dollars to influence that legislation in any way possible, because that's what our system allows for. And I suppose this brings us to that all-important prediction segment. What is the future of loot boxes? Well, for the moment, it's very easy to predict the future of loot boxes. We're pretty much guaranteed to stay within phase 1, with occasional dips into phase 2 when things get really bad and company PR is threatened, along with revenue. If people keep purchasing microtransactions of any kind, we'll keep getting them. The worst industry brands will continue to look for more efficient and cost-effective ways to exploit players. But just for kicks, let's say that things do move to phase 3. Loot boxes are making very little money, and video game company growth slows drastically, and none of the social engineering tricks are working anymore. Even then, we would probably see the formation of a certification board organized by the video game industry itself, similar to the formation of the ESRB, and we all know how that turned out. Some of the more vocal anti-loot box activists would be given jobs within video game companies, but very little influence in the decision-making process. And there would be a concentrated effort to continue to allow at least certain forms of microtransactions and loot boxes, and regulating those would be taking it too far, according to the companies that stand to lose a lot if more intense regulations were to go through. Companies would hold E3 panels where they can select the participants. Even in phase 3, loot boxes and predatory microtransactions would be minimized, not eliminated. But until then, here we are. Not only do we need to raise awareness with regards to the negative effects of loot boxes, but we also need to collectively find ways to resist and overcome social engineering tactics specifically designed to get people to spend money. And that's hard. This is hard work. It's difficult even to think about this stuff, but it is possible to influence change, as corny as that sounds. At the very least, can we please continue to talk about this stuff? Because the really sad part, and something that brings us back to the paper from Benson and Kirsch, is that resignation just happens naturally. There comes a point where it's so much easier to give up or just say that there's not a problem when there so obviously is. Here's another quote from the paper, and it's a long one. Capital manages critique in such a way that recognition of and discontent about harm are converted into structures of feeling that promote cynicism about the ability to alter social structures and makes resignation a dominant mode of political action. The source of popular discontent prevalent in everyday life, what we have called the politics of resignation, may be not the recognition that capitalism operates like a casino that creates ever-widening gaps between winners and losers, but rather the pervasive sense that no form of critique has traction. Amidst a politics of resignation, we need a new starting point. How do we unlock the folded arms of cynicism? We suggest that an answer can be found in a critique of capital that focuses on industry's avoidance of ethical responsibility for the harms caused to humans and environments. So far as I can see, quite a few major companies in the video game industry have been avoiding responsibility in so many different ways and in so many situations. They could turn that around themselves and really improve, but I'm not too eager to wait around for that to happen. And I know that this is a lot. It's a lot to think about, and videos like these are much more difficult to watch than a reaction video about the latest episode of Captain Bird and his superhero friend, but I do think that it's important. So if you stuck around for all of this, wow, thank you. I'm tired, and I wasn't even watching it. I mean, anyone who stuck around, you are why I get out of bed in the morning. Thank you so much for being here, and please take a look at what other people online are saying about all this stuff. Okay, I think I'm gonna go back to making easy videos about cartoon shows for a bit. I still haven't watched the original run of The Tick. Can you believe that? The video's over. I just wanted to add some voiceover where I'm not so serious and upset. What's going on with you? Pretty hot day over here. It's gonna get up to 90. I've got to, I don't have AC. It's the whole thing, but it's still a nice day. I like to see a good sunny day. Got a lot of carrots. They sent me so many carrots. I tried eating them